There's some huge news that came out about the Corporate Transparency Act. The Eastern District of Texas issued a nationwide preliminary injunction in favor of a company called Texas Top Cop Shop, Inc. They sued Eric Garland at the Department of Justice, alleging or claiming that the Corporate Transparency Act was unconstitutional. And the judge in that case agreed. The judge issued a preliminary nationwide injunction, which specifically stops enforcement of the Corporate Transparency Act and the reporting rules that were authorized under the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, also known as the Corporate Transparency Act, and that became effective on January 1 of 2024. What that means is that you don't have to follow the CTA. The injunction means the court stopped enforcement of the law. So getting into the details a little bit here, there was a plaintiff who thought that the law was unconstitutional. The law came into effect. Corporate Transparency Act was passed actually in 2021 under something called the National Defense Authorization Act, and it became effective after a long sort of back and forth with the Department of Treasury, and FinCEN became effective in January of 2024. It requires every company, or was requiring every company, to file with FinCEN a beneficial ownership report for every business entity. Texas Top Cop Shop, Inc. sued Eric Garland, sued the Department of Justice and said this thing is unconstitutional. This law is unconstitutional. And the court in Texas agreed. They felt that the plaintiff, Texas Top Cop Shop, Inc., was likely to prevail on constitutional grounds, that it exceeded the government's authority, the Congress's and the president's authority to establish this law. And this injunction specifically stops enforcement of the Corporate Transparency Act and the reporting rules, and stays, which means stops. You don't have to comply with the deadline that for most companies was going to be December 31st of 2024. So as a result, you are no longer required to comply with the CTA's beneficial ownership reporting deadlines. It's not a done deal, however. So just to give you a little bit on how the courts work, you have a district court, and this is a federal district court. Federal district court, they make a ruling. The plaintiff asked for this injunction to stop the enforcement of the law. The court agreed. Now that can be appealed. It goes up through the appeals courts, and there's different circuit courts around the nation depending on where that district court is located. This is in the Fifth Circuit. So the ruling, this injunction, can be appealed by the Department of Justice. If they decide to appeal it, then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals will look at this ruling, this injunction by the district court, and decide whether it should hold, whether perhaps it shouldn't be nationally, it should only apply to plaintiffs. A lot of different things can happen. It can be appealed again from there. Potentially, it can be appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they can make a decision about, whether this injunction should be applied or not. Typically, if the circuit court is going to say the nationwide preliminary injunction should hold through the outcome of the case, it would not go up to the Supreme Court, but you never know. Okay, there's probably some well-funded plaintiffs in this case. In any case, that ruling will usually, by the Fifth Circuit, could usually and will usually take months unless there's emergency. But even in that case, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be said. We won't get into that. Okay. The question, though, because we've got some interesting things happening. Remember, the Department of Justice is the one who's defending. Eric Garland is the one who's defending. What do we know is going to happen in January of 2025? A new administration's coming in. President Donald Trump and new Department of Justice leadership that's likely going to have an impact on whether there's even an appeal. If it wasn't appealed, if the appeal wasn't pursued, then that injunction is going to stay until the completion of the case in its entirety through the district court, through the appeals process, all the way up potentially to the Supreme Court. So the question then is, and this is, we're getting into I'm theorizing here, right? This isn't, this is more of an opinion piece. The question is, what happens when there's a change in the administration and Department of Justice leadership? Well, here's the really interesting part. President Donald Trump vetoed the enabling statute back when in his former term, right? In the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act contained the enabling statutes. Trump vetoed it, but it was actually overridden by Congress. It was an override of his veto. Now the question is, trying to look into the mind of Donald Trump, why did he veto the National Defense Authorization Act in 2021? I have to tell you, it wasn't about the CTA. That would be clear that there was not going to be a pursuit of the appeal, that he would welcome that change. His statements were about critical national security measures, including provisions that fail to respect veterans, military history, contradicts efforts by his administration to put America first in national security and foreign policy actions. He said it was a gift to China and Russia. And so the question of, did he then, I did research, I didn't find any statements by then President Donald Trump, or during the period of time that he was not president, didn't find any statements about the Corporate Transparency Act. So it wasn't the reason he vetoed the bill. So then what, based on how Donald Trump ran for president, again, looking into the mind of Donald Trump, there's some things that lead me to believe that this is not going to be high up on the list for Donald Trump and for his administration. For example, we have the DOGE, what a group that's supposed to be looking on how do we eliminate expense and how do we eliminate, reduce the debt for the federal government. There's a big burden here, not just on business owners, but a big burden on the different agencies involved in maintaining and updating this database. They've been really slow with getting things done. I think it's been a Herculean effort on their part. And there is a, sort of a hands-off business approach that I think is favored by the incoming administration that would likely, I'm not going to make a prediction, but I see there's a high probability that there is a lack of enforcement, or I should say a lack of defense of this law by the incoming administration. If it's not appealed, well, the potential would be that the Biden administration appeals to the Fifth Circuit. Okay. The Fifth Circuit, though, as we said before, is going to take several months likely to determine whether even the injunction should apply, never mind on the merits of the case. And when the administration changed, the decision could be made that DOJ is just going to withdraw its appeal. That would mean that the findings of the district court would become the prevailing law and would be applicable for everyone going forward, meaning that the CTA would be effectively dead. This is it's very new. It's very developing. As of the date of the filming of this, the Department of Treasury and its FinCEN enforcement network has not commented on the decision. And so we're sort of a wait and see, a hold approach here about what is going to happen. But because of the change in administration and a lot of other things, looks like we got at least a little breathing room when it comes to the Corporate Transparency Act enforcement. So stay tuned for additional updates as they come.